And I stayed in that property. This was in Dharamsala. And I was crying, crying, crying under a tree. But it was tears of joy. It was a tears of connection. I had connected to something that was always there. And and I remember that the guards came and were like, okay, you have to leave. And as I was leaving, there was the last person in line who was Japanese, and he asked the Dalai Lama about like anything special. I think it was a journalist or a photographer, and anything special that you have to tell me. And his Dalai Lama said, no, not really. And then he said, yes, a good heart is the best religion. And for some reason, that was like,
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Awoken Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Rackison. Today, our guest is Alejandro Chaoul. Alejandro is a truly wise and experienced soul, immersed in the ancient and magical Boon Tibetan tradition for more than 30 years. Alejandro also holds a PhD in Tibetan religions and is the director of the Mind Body Spirit Institute at the Young Center of Houston. An author and teacher, Alejandro has been sharing Tibetan yoga, sound healing, and philosophy for more than 2 decades. Alejandro can be found online at alichahoul.com and teaching around the world at leading institutes including Esalen and Omega, and from May 31st to June 1st at LA's only Ocean View Wellness Studio and an overall great place, the Awoken Space. Our following conversation will cover Alejandro's upbringing, his intro to spirituality, travels in India, meeting Swami Chinmayananda, the Dalai Lama, and the Boon lineage. We'll also cover pre-Buddhist religion in Tibet, shamanism, the nature of mind, the difference between Indian Hatha and Tibetan yoga, Alejandro's book recommendations, his morning routine, the nature of archetype and myth, and much more. I hope you enjoy what is truly an enlightening and worthwhile conversation. This is the Awoken Podcast. How do you identify? Who are you?
that's a good question. So I guess I'm a human being, originally born this life in Argentina and immigrated here to the States and been here for 20 some years. I moved mostly to do my part of my undergrad education and then my grad education, mostly in originally in communications and philosophy, and then in religious studies, particularly Tibetan religions and spirituality. And yeah, and as I was here in Houston at Rice doing my PhD, I started working in the area of health. So I had been learning both academically, but also with Tibetan teachers. Actually, my main Tibetan teacher just turned 100 years old. I was in Nepal with him a month ago. And and so my work in my dissertation was on Tibetan yoga, Tibetan mind-body practices and applications in health. So being here in Houston, next to the largest medical center in the world, probably, I started volunteering at MD Anderson, which is a large cancer center, and bringing these practices with the support and mentorship of my teachers. And that really became a very important path in my life. And I think I was able to help many people going through the cancer journey through these practices. And so, in a way, I'm sitting in this um, confluence of Tibetan spirituality, health, well-being, and spiritual development in general, and what in Esalen they would call human potential.
Well, you've answered aspects of my next couple of questions also, which is more about your background and how were you exposed to spirituality and Buddhism. So let's back it up slightly then. And then if you can tell us just from the beginning then, where were you raised
Yeah.
and what was your early life like in your childhood and if there was any spiritual upbringing along
Mm.
with that.
So I was born in Argentina, which is a very Catholic country, and but I was born in a Jewish family, not very religious, but somewhat. Um, we would go for the high holidays to the synagogue, and I started interacting more in the area of leadership there, and particularly we had a rabbi that was also very strong in human rights, and Argentina was going through a very difficult period in that sense with military coup and so forth. Um, and so as I was
Is this
growing,
the era of is it Ava?
so actually, so Eva Perón was earlier. So Eva Perón was in the 40s.
Oh,
This was
sorry.
in the second Perón, Juan Domingo Perón's presidency in the 70s, where then after he died, and then his second wife, Isabel Perón, was reigning. Yes, so that was the coup um, against her, and so we had a long period of military that ended actually with the loss at the Malvinas War, but the or the Falkland War, as the British would say. Um, but during that time, it was really a period of uncertainty and at the same time of inner search. And so, it was a period where the there was a lot of violence, both what some people would call inner terrorism as well as government terrorism. And and so we had bombs exploding, we had people being taken out of the streets in black cars and tortured and um, my own personal memory of that too was that I was having what I called then existential attacks, which were I'm going to die and then what? What's going to happen? And it was actually quite profound, besides kind of the symptoms of waking up at night and sweating and having this anxiety. It was also a period of inner search, and somehow the book Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse landed on my lap, and I read it a number of times. And one of the things that was very important for me was two things. One was this part of the suffering of birth, old age, sickness, and death. And then the second part, that there was a way out of this suffering, which was the path of meditation. And so I became very interested in learning what this was.
And
And
how old were you when you first encountered that book?
so when I first encountered the book, I was around 8 or 9 years old.
Oh, okay.
And by the time I finally was able to connect to someone who became my first meditation teacher, Miguel Angel, I was around 15. So it
So
took
you're
me,
saying these existential fears you were having were prior to this at 8 or so, or
no,
throughout this whole period?
it was around that time. Yeah, yeah, between 8, 9, 10. I don't remember exactly when I got the book because I don't even remember from whom. But what's interesting, I still have it in Spanish and covered with
The
contact.
same book.
Same book.
Yeah.
I also bought it in English while I was here. But yeah, and so it was a very um, kind of hallmark in my life. And when I became more and more interested also in these Asian traditions, what did they have to contribute to that inner search? And so I was actually studying advertising at that time. And so when I got to college time, and there was an opportunity to be a transfer student, come to the US, to Boston, and I did. And while I was there, I started getting in touch with Zen meditation, with the Hare Krishnas and vegetarian cooking, and learning more about Indian philosophy and other Eastern
And where
traditions.
was this again? Sorry.
This was in Boston,
Okay.
Boston University. And and then I also got in touch with other great people like Elie Wiesel was teaching there. Um, and Howard Zinn was teaching there. So I really got a quite a wide exposure. And at the same time, that was the place where Martin Luther King got his PhD. So it was a very wonderful place and very open and very connected to many other universities. And so it was a great learning experience and also meeting people from all over the world. It was very international as well. And particularly, again, I was really interested in this inner search. And I got to meet a lot of people from India, and that was really touching. I'm still actually in touch with many of them. And but that prompted that when I graduated in the late 80s, I traveled to India. So my first trip to India was 89, 90. I stayed for 9 months, which I consider as a second gestation period in my life. And during that time, I got to meet people from a lot of different traditions, including Hinduism and Jainism and Buddhism. And Islam. And I was drawn particularly to a couple of teachers, first in the Hindu tradition, to U.G. Krishnamurti, not the famous J.D. Krishnamurti, but U.G. Krishnamurti, which was actually, it was an impressive time. I still remember that meeting where basically all my philosophical understanding crumbled, and it was a sense of relief. It was like, "Oh, this is wonderful." It was almost like dropping from the brain to the heart. And it was very opening and very relaxing. But when I asked about what's next, the response was, now just be.
This is Krishnamurti.
Yeah, and I had no clue on how just be. And so after 3 days of being there and not having more guidance than that, I left. I met other great teachers, particularly Swami Chinmayananda. But really
Yeah, I I'm a fan of his, and I like his student, who I went on a big journey to meet, Swami Dayananda Saraswati, who passed. But yeah, I had a whole journey to meet him.
oh, wonderful. Yeah. So Swami Chinmayananda was an incredible person that actually started a little bit as a skeptic journalist
Yeah,
in
yeah,
England.
he's
And
hilarious.
Yeah, and he was very funny, yeah, but also very knowledgeable, and he was also very open because after being with him and some of his other student teachers, um, I met the Tibetans in Ladakh, and after being in touch with them, I wanted to meet the Dalai Lama, and then I got to meet him. And I told Swamiji, I said, I'm actually going with the Dalai Lama and the Tibetans. And I remember he was sitting on a table like this, eating. I was on the floor. So he was giving me food, blessed food, what they call prasad. And he said, you're not coming, you're not going, all is Maya, go, go, my son. So I felt as a great blessing for him to go say, yeah, go with the Tibetans, that is fine. And I went to meet the Dalai Lama, and I had a number of opportunities to see him in public. And in one of them, where I was actually able to reach with him in a public blessing, I offered him a flower, actually a saffron flower that I had from my trip to Kashmir. And he asked me, "So, what's your name?" And I couldn't speak. I was like, "And where are you coming from?" And he said, there was a big line. So basically, he gave me a kata and a blessed cord and some medicine, and basically showed me my way out. And and I stayed in that property. This was in Dharamsala. And I was crying, crying, crying under a tree. But it was tears of joy. It was a tears of connection. I had connected to something that was always there. And and I remember that the guards came and were like, okay, you have to leave. And as I was leaving, there was the last person in line who was Japanese, and he asked the Dalai Lama about like anything special. I think it was a journalist or a photographer, and anything special that you have to tell me. And his Dalai Lama said, no, not really. And then he said, yes, a good heart is the best religion. And for some reason, that was like, and in fact, a couple of years later, I was able to be part of the organizing committee of the Dalai Lama's first visit to Argentina in 92. And I put together a little book. And of course, I called it Un buen corazón es la mejor religión. A good heart is the best religion. And so that was really kind of the strong connection to that lineage. And when I was in India, they had told me, dig in many holes, and then when you find water, keep digging. So I've been digging in that hole for 30 some years. Yeah.
And you've gotten very deep in it, which is why you're such a wonderful person to share these practices. Um, but so what was your exposure then to the bone tradition, and eventually, I suppose Tenzin Wayngal Rinpoche and that part of the lineage?
Sure, of course. So when I came back to Argentina, so before coming back to Argentina, and I wanted to study with the Dalai Lama, and of course they said, you and a million others, he doesn't really take individual students or very few. I was not in that group, and so they said, but there's many lamas here. And so I was actually by chance, I had rented a little room in a monastery, and the Lama came like a month after, and I got to meet him. And this was Yeshe Dorje Rinpoche. This was a wonderful Nakpa yogi that actually was the weatherman for the Dalai Lama. And he would control the hail to stop it if there was a big ceremony, or bring rain if there was drought. And actually, he visited Los Angeles as well. And he then lived in San Gabriel for a while. That's also then he passed away in that area. But he was an amazing person, and I got connected with him, and I learned from him a wonderful path that the Tibetans call the Ngondro, or the preliminary practices. And even though they seem to be kind of heavy because it's like you have to do 100,000 of this and 100,000 of that, for me, it was a beautiful path because it was like being dive into the river that at some point will lead to the ocean. So I didn't care how long you will take me. I just wanted a path because the just be didn't work for me. And it was a wonderful path. And as I was doing that, it ended up taking me around 7 years to finish that. But I went back to Argentina, came back to the United States in 93 to see him before he passed away. And I was also connected to Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche. And Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche directed me to meet Lopon Tenzin Namdak, who I was just mentioning. He's just turned 100 years old. And so I met him, and it was right before the Kalachakra in 91 in New York. And it was like, oh my God, this is it. And then I met one of his students, a teacher in his own right, Tenzin Wayngal Rinpoche, that you mentioned.
In India.
No, I met Tenzin Wayngal Rinpoche in Albuquerque, actually, the first time. And then he told me he was going to bring Lopon, and he was doing this training, 7 year training. And so I was able to start that training that later that year. There were a lot of other things happening, but I was able to do it. And that first time where I saw them together, it was magic. It was like the whole refuge tree, the whole lineage was alive. And I was like,
They seem very happy.
this is it. And yeah, I mean, that moment of seeing them together, which actually I saw them a number of times together. I just saw them together again, but um, yeah, beautiful.
What qualities do you think you were picking up on? Is I sense when I'm looking at photos of um that lineage there's a like with many Tibetans, but especially them, they're very happy. It seems like the smiles are just, you can feel it in your soul. It's there's energy in their joy.
Yeah, it's beautiful because there is energy, there's joy, but there's also acknowledgement of one's suffering, right? So, like Lupin would say, yeah, my knee is still blessed by a Chinese bullet escaping Tibet, right? So and yet he is there, fully wonderful, being teaching for decades, training so many people. And so it's just quite amazing. And I've been so fortunate of having so many opportunities to learn with him, both in India, Nepal, France, the US. And then of course with Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, um, even just this year, I was with him in January in Brazil, in February in Nepal, in March here in Houston, in April in Virginia. So, being able to always learn. And as they asked me to start teaching in the mid 90s, that doesn't, it's just a start to share, but always continue to learn. And so for me, that's really important and beautiful in that connection to the teachers and what I'm asked to teach and in what way. So I'm always kind of going back and making sure that I'm doing it in a way that makes sense, both to the lineage and to this day and in an age and where I'm teaching.
I'm quite interested in uh, the bone, and I think through understanding the bone, you can understand quite a lot about the history of Tibet, the recent history at least, and the religion and the introduction of Buddhism. So I have some questions along that line.
Okay.
And so, well, how would you describe um, gods and deities in Tibet? And then we'll go more into the early history, but just what are deities and what are gods to Tibetans?
Hmm. So so the usual way that you see, as we translate these terms, so and I don't know who decided to translate them in this way, but usually in the Tibetan um in the Tibetan world, when they use this word for that, it's translating as gods. Sometimes they use also the Sanskrit word deva. It's actually a non-enlightened being. So the gods in that is part of the samsara, part of the circle of cyclic existence. And it's even though it's the upper circle, it's the kind of beings that have everything and they don't realize they're suffering. And so at the end of their lives, they are like, oh, shoot, I haven't done anything with my life. And they go back into the circle. Um,
So they weren't freed from
they,
samsara. They
no. But then the deities, the Idam, yeah, those are enlightened beings that have different qualities and that they are supportive to our practice. And that in some qualities, sometimes they have a specific quality like loving kindness or wisdom or compassion, and so when you connect to that deity, many times through visualization or through a mantra, um, there's a way of, as you connect, what you're doing also, you're developing that quality in you. And many times, um, whether it's through astrology or through another spiritual means, you would be said, you connect to this particular deity, right? And so what they're saying is cultivate that quality,
right.
right? So, for example, I remember uh, I was still in the monastery of my first teacher, Yeshe Dorje Rinpoche. The monastery is called Zinlong Kagiling in Dharamsala, for those who have been there in the Baksunat Road. And um, and I remember that he actually had an amazing statue maker. And the statue maker was the disciple of the statue maker of the 13th Dalai Lama. And he made these great statues. And I had been told that my idam was Manjushri, was the the deity related to wisdom. So I guess that's what I needed to develop. And he made me a wonderful statue made of mud and painted. I still have it in my altar. And and so that's one way you relate to that specific deity or idam.
So yeah, I mean, I've sort of surmised that much of polytheism was connecting to the qualities associated with the deity. And even in our modern day media, characters like Superman and Spiderman, you're really connecting to the qualities of goodness and heroism and things like that. So storytelling and myth, it makes sense that that was present in early uh, ancient Tibet. And and then so what was religion like in Tibet before Buddhism?
Well, I'm not sure, but I can tell you what I think from, I can gather from different sources. So there were a lot of different aspects of religiosity and spirituality and shamanism. They wouldn't call it shamanism actually, but related more to the earth and or to the um, elements. And then what was called burn, there was actually many different kinds of burn. There was one that was more the one that a lot of people would call shamanic aspects and those kind of priests and very connected to the elements and so forth. And there was at some point they talk about earlier on also even having sacrifices, animal sacrifices and so forth. Um, but but actually in the burn that we know, what we call Yundrung burn or the eternal burn, actually that's not the case, and it's very similar to what then became Tibetan Buddhism. So when Buddhism came to Tibet in around the 7th, 8th century, there was burn was already present, and there was, like in many other places with other religions, there was a confluence which included actually both taking from each other, fighting, kind of the fighting for supremacy or for who's in charge, and um, but but I think looking at the enriching side, um, there was there was a clear difference that enriched Tibetan Buddhism and made it Tibetan Buddhism, which is very different than the Buddhism in many cases, in many things, it's very different than the Buddhism that came from India, the Buddhism that you see in Sri Lanka and Thailand, but even also very different than the Buddhism that you see in China and Japan. For one, is very colorful. So you always have the five elements and the five colors, the prayer flags. So their connection to the elements are there. So there are rituals related to what in the Tibetan tradition, we don't call it shaman, we call it the causal vehicles towards the result vehicles. And there are things like not only rituals, but medicine is part of that. Astrology is part of that. So there's many things that are part of those knowledges that are called that are for this lifetime and that then can be used to develop your, we call it mind, but in some traditions, maybe they call it soul. And usually we say it's based here, that kind of you learn in this body. And when you leave this Airbnb, you still continue in another one and keep on learning until you finally learn to liberate. So, so in that sense, Buddhism and Burn have uh, the same goal of, in English we use the word Buddhahood, in Tibetan Sanjepa. So it's about getting enlightened, connecting to that full human potential, spiritual potential. Um, but they trace their lineage. So, in the majority of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, they trace it to Buddha Shakyamuni, who was born in India, Nepal, actually, Lumbini, um, in 6th century BCE. And then in the burn traces it back to another Buddha called Tonpa Shenrab, that it's supposed to be thousands of years ago. They would say 18,000. I'm not sure, but so that's a little bit. But it's hard to know.
Yeah, I was just refreshing myself about some of that, and I saw Timpa Shenrab described as both a prince, similar to um, s- the Indian Buddha.
Okay.
And then also being more of a celestial being who descended from the upper realm. What do they call it? Uh,
Tushita,
the Olma Lungri.
Olmo
Yeah.
Lundgren. Yeah.
Um, is there what have you heard? Was he?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to be totally honest, if you think of practice, I don't really care.
Yeah.
I
But I
think,
just wonder, did he have the same? Because that's a slight distinction. If he had the humble beginnings of, well, a prince isn't humble, but a prince who
right.
renounces his princeliness and becomes an ascetic,
Yeah.
or
I
if he
mean,
came from kind of the higher realms.
I think even when you think of any of these starters of religions, from a perspective of Buddhism, for example, it was probably not his first lifetime. I mean, uh, by then, hopefully, he had more spiritual richness, and maybe, the story of being a prince is one way of telling it. The story of coming from the heavens is another. I mean, there are always, I think there are different different narratives in a way touch different people in different ways. My own sense
Do
and
you do you feel
follow,
that the Rinpoches and do they take these stories literally, or is it metaphor to them?
it depends. I think different ones take it in different ways. I mean, again, a lot of them grew up and stayed in Asia, and whether they're in Tibet or they were able to escape and to India, Nepal, and other places, or they're in the West. As you grow and learn different things, you are influenced by that. And so I think even in Rinpoches, which there's thousands of them,
Right.
there's a whole panoply of different beliefs.
What do you feel distinguishes bone from the other lineages?
Well, for me, one of the main things, and again, I don't know if it's distinguishing, I think it is, at least from the Burn, from these teachers, from Lopon Tenzin Namdak, from His Holiness Lungto Tempanima, from Tenzin Wayngal Rinpoche, and all the others that have followed, it's very direct. It's uh, the philosophy is important, but it's really about, are you in the nature of mind or not? Uh, and so very following the philosophy of Dzogchen, which is also the philosophy that some of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, particularly the Nyingma, had, is the same philosophy as Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche used to have. He actually founded the Dzogchen community, and he's the one who directed me to Lopon. So, so I think it's within that tradition of really cutting through and really getting to the essence and then trying to stay in the essence and
Would you
being
say, how would you characterize the nature of mind?
the nature of mind um, is the state of mind where all arises and all dissolves, is the state of mind of that you can describe as the qualities being spacious and at the same time radiant. And so the ways they're illustrated is like sky and sun together, so that light and space produce rays, which are our actions of body, speech, mind, that if you, as some of the Dzogchen texts would say, Tawa Tadrel Gomparaksel Chokpa Lukpa, that if you are in that state of mind, it's limitless. The view is limitless. So the meditation is self-illuminated, self-illuminated. And then the activities manifest spontaneously from them, like rays from that. And so it's in a way, it's very difficult to describe. It's not really graspable. The moment you grasp is the moment you lose it. So, but it's experiential. And in the Dzogchen tradition, there are ways of introducing one to the nature of mind that everyone already has. So it's not something that is kind of put into, but you're awakened to your nature of mind.
So you mentioned I've been pronouncing it dog chen. I don't know what you have a much more correct pronunciation of some of these words.
Yeah, Dzogchen. So Dzog means complete or perfect, and Chen means big. So Dzogpa Chenpo or Dzogchen means the great completeness, the great perfection.
I learned a Mahamudra meditation from the Kagyu
Uh-huh.
lineage, which very similar to how they talk about
Yeah.
Dogchen.
Yeah, Mahamudra and Dzogchen are very similar.
Um, yeah, I find that it's very powerful in attuning um, the nature of nature and um, so.
Yeah.
But then there's also the more physical practices. So, at what point did you start getting interested in Trollcore and Salung and Tibetan yoga
Yeah.
and start
Actually,
practicing that?
I was able to get early on. So the first time I even knew that there was a Tibetan yoga was when Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche came to Argentina in so I came, he had come already a year before, but so I met him in 1990, end of 1990, beginning of 91. And that's where I heard he used to call it Yantra Yoga. And so, and I learned from him and from one of his senior students, Fabio Andrico. And I was like, wow, this is great. And I had done Tai Chi before and other kinds of yoga. And I thought, this is fantastic. And then a couple of years later, when I was in Tritanobutse in Lopon's monastery in Nepal, I they told me about this other Trungkor, this other Tibetan yoga, and a monk from the region of Amdo had come, and he taught us. We were a group of four Westerners, one from Hong Kong, one from Switzerland, one from Italy, and myself. And we were very lucky, but it was very typical Tibetan. In 3 days, it was like ba 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 ba. Not even full 3 days. It was mornings because in the afternoons we were going to Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche's teachings, and uh, and it was on the floor, cement floor, and but I was able to get the text and get copies of things, and so then I actually stayed another month in the monastery, and I continued practicing with the monks every day. And then I came back to Argentina and I continued practicing them. And then I came back to the States and I told Tenzin Wayngal Rinpoche that I had learned these and they were fantastic. And so he met with me every morning at 5. We went over them and then he started asking me to teach them. And that's how it started back in 95. And that was 94. And then 95, he asked me to create a more, how to start. We were talking about what's the best way of teaching because this Tibetan way may not be the best for Westerners. And actually, it took us a while to create a curriculum that we felt was more for Westerners. In 2000, we put a curriculum together and been teaching that text since. But then a few years later, I was able to go to India to Menri Monastery, and with His Holiness Lungto Tempanima and Ponlop Tinlanima, I learned another Trungkor, which is from the instructions of the Ao, the Atri. And so both are great Trungkor. I actually wrote a book for each of these. And I teach them, I practice them constantly, daily. I teach them, and I look forward to teaching part of that in Malibu, and as well as some of the sounds that resonate with these practices are really kind of, as Rinpoche would put in his book, awakening the sacred body. So it really awakens us through bringing the breath through the channels, awakening each chakra, and then the movements do that by breathing and holding and moving and exhaling, and sometimes with sounds, and resting in that space that becomes available, and then energizing with sounds as well. And so, yeah, beautiful practices that support being back in that meditative state, kind of helping you recognize that natural state of mind. So many times, what happens is, although we all have that natural state of mind, we're cluttered to it. And so, as we do these movements, as we do these sounds, as we do these practices, these breathings, they're ways of clearing away obstacles. Actually, in the Tibetan tradition, we call it geksel. Kind of sel is clearing, gek is gek, is you clear your own gek. And as you clear that, then you're able to be in that more spacious place. And as you are able to stay there, focus, train in that, then the awareness arises, and we support that meditative state. We call it Bugdan, or enhancing the meditative practices. So what happens with these methods is that they are methods that support your wisdom. So we call method and wisdom like the two wings of the bird that needs to fly. And so as we do that, we actually are rest also in a sitting posture that we say it's like an eagle soaring in the sky, this sense of flow, but being very present. You're not going somewhere else. You're just here, fully present, connecting to your natural state of mind, and noticing when you get disconnected, using something to come back.
And so you'll be teaching both Salung and Trollcore. And Salung is the more energetic practices working with the subtle body and Lung. And then Trollcore is more of a physical practice. Is that right?
They're both using, actually, I
Energy.
would say Tsalung Trungkor. They're both, even though they come from different texts, they really support each other. So, what I usually do is I'll check who's there and what they need, and I'll do some practice of Tsalung, some practice of Trungkor, and some practices of sound, and that support resting in meditation. And I look forward to being there resting with a beautiful view of the sea.
Yes.
And it's very supportive for practice.
But just so people understand, how would you distinguish and what makes Tibetan body oriented practices and the seat syllable practices different from some things you might find in Hatha yoga?
That's a big, so there's some things that are similar, in terms of, if you think you're using your body, your breath, your mind, uh, to get to that meditative state. And on other things, the differences come by, for example, we most of the times, well, actually, all the movements are movements. They're not fixed asana. Second, most of them also, we are holding the breath in a particular chakra, or we are holding the breath in the whole body. And then we're doing a movement. And with that movement, what we're doing, it's kind of steering that area. So then when we exhale, we release and rest. So that's a little bit of some parts of the difference. And so it's very active, and at the same time, it allows you to rest and maintain awareness. I call them as a way of rebooting my system, right? So for example, every movement, you do a movement, and sometimes it's up, then you do another movement, and then you rest. So it's very supportive of your practice. And so with that, I find it's almost like a way of constantly bringing you back to that state of mind. Like, ha pe, did you get it? Ha pe, so it's a very active and at the same time very supportive practice.
I've watched videos of Tibetan yogis, if you call them yogis, or Tibetan people doing these practices, and it seems the movements are often much more jerky and much more, I don't want to use the word violent, but explosive, and not as shanti as you would see in some Indian yoga traditions. So, why do you think that is?
I think there's differences for different people. Like even if you think of hatha yoga, hatha means, hatha, so it's strong. So I think in the West also we have the way that Indian yoga came, it's almost like these stretching, but that's not really how most
Right.
it's practiced. So there's different ways of practicing, and I think it's like for different audiences, and I think that's important to understand. So when I teach in MD Anderson for cancer patients, I would teach it in a different way that when I teach to, you know, other groups of people. So and I learned that from my teachers. I, see them teaching differently to psychologists that they would do to people in Dharma or people that are academics. And so I think,
But if they're teaching them themselves, if they're teaching the most authentic brand, um,
well, if they're teaching the most authentic, if you want to use that word, uh, you know, these teachings wouldn't be taught until you have done a lot of other practices. So yeah, even in the manuals of practice, they come at the very end. So yeah, you would expect people that are doing these practices to have a very thorough and deep meditation practice, um, breathing practice, and then you learn the Trungkor. But the way we teach it in the West is understanding that that's not the case, and so we do it in a way that it's open to everyone. And actually, the body for many in the West can be a great segue
yeah.
into the mind because when you ask someone, like it was for me, just be, how do you be? Well, do this movement, do this, let go of that. What you feel now, stay there. Now you can be. So you use this as a skillful means to support that.
Okay, I think we have about 3 minutes, so we're going to do some rapid fire fun questions. To start, what would you title your autobiography at this point in your life?
Autobiography. I don't know. I never thought of that. Uh, I don't know. An Argentinian roaming in samsara that, um, searching for meaning in life.
What is your morning routine like, and how long does it take you to check your emails and things like that?
Oh, so my morning routine usually doesn't include the emails. So my morning routine is actually the first part. Usually we just take 10, 15 minutes with my wife. We do some breathing, some movement, some sounds, and then we drink mate together, which is a Argentinian drink. And then we talk about our day, and then each one goes their way. And then usually, and again, each day may be different, I would go to my altar room, do my practice, and including Tsalung and Trunkor and other prayers and praying for people who have passed away and people who are ill and, sharing the benefits to people that are suffering in all these different ways, wars and being laid off and so forth. And then, yes, I would uh, probably either have to go somewhere to teach or do something online or look at my emails and have breakfast and coffee and start my day.
Well, yes, it's great to hear that you cultivate your peace of mind first and primarily. Um, just very quickly, what books would you recommend to people, or just one book? What will be the most
Mm,
important book for one person, for someone to read?
you know, I think different people need different doorways. So for some people, I would immediately say, well, Tenzin Wayngal Rinpoche's book, like Awakening the Sacred Body, would be great, or Tibetan sound healing. For other people that are more maybe that they like a little of the philosophy, Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche's book, The Crystal and the Way of Light, is a great book. For people who are interested in Trungkor, there's either some of the Yantra Yoga books or some of the books I wrote on Tibetan Yoga for health and well-being or the magical movements of body, breath, and mind. So it really depends.
And then just to close out, if you have any phrase or sentiment you'd like to leave the listeners with to resonate as we end the podcast, what would it be?
So, I go back to those words of the Dalai Lama, a good heart is the best religion. But what does that mean? So for me, what that means today is really connecting to that natural state of mind, meditative state of mind, and through which you connect to that sense of natural compassion that emanates from that. So it's like the wings are unfold, and as you fly, this naturally, and it's also that these practices are not just kind of this spiritual bypassing, like, oh, everything is okay. No, you know, and this might not sound very good, but bring your shit to the cushion. Bring it, but in a specific way, not in a way that it's your rotten karmic cushion, but in a way that you are settling, being ready so that you are in a place of spaciousness, awareness, and warmth, that as you bring that, which is Rinpoche, Tenzin Wayngal Rinpoche would call your pain identities, that you can embrace them and work with them. Kind of by that embracing, I love this word that they use in Mexico, which we don't use in Argentina, but I love it. It's apapacho. Apapacho is this embrace from and to the soul. And so this sense of warmth and caring rather than rejecting and judging, that's for me a good heart.